Bipartisan Republicans, bipartisan Republicans, bipartisan Republicans, bipartisan Republicans, bipartisan Republican, bipartisan care, bipartisan House, bipartisan Republican, bipartisan House, Republican, bipartisan
care, Republicans care,
bipartisan Republican,
bipartisan
House, bipartisan Republicans, bipartisan Republicans, House, Republican, bipartisan Republican House, bipartisan Republicans, bipartisan
bipartisan care trillion House,
bipartisan House, Republican,
share bipartisan
Republicans,
trillion,
bipartisan trillion House, bipartisan Republican House, Republican,
House, Republican, bipartisan, Republicans,
House.